The weight of Sergeant Solis's rifle case hit the mud with a sound like a body dropping, because Lieutenant Drain had kicked it there, in front of everyone, and then he smiled. "You sure you got the right course, Solis?" She picked it up without answering. That was the first morning. There are people who walk into a room and immediately understand the geometry of hostility, where it's coming from, how fast it's moving, whether it has a name yet, or if it's still just a feeling in the air. Solis was one of those people. She had learned to read rooms the way some soldiers read terrain, looking for cover, looking for elevation, looking for the one direction nobody was watching. The Advanced Sniper Integration course at Fort Cabot ran 8 weeks. Solis had been told 3 times, once by her company commander, once by a senior NCO she respected, and once by a man she'd never met who seemed to know things anyway, that she would not finish, not because of her scores, not because of her because of the particular combination of things she was, young, female, and better than most of the men she'd be standing next to. She had been warned. She went anyway. The first week was designed to break people before they had time to find their footing. Pre-dawn formations in temperatures that made the darkness feel physical. Land navigation through terrain that had been deliberately marked wrong on older maps, which some candidates didn't realize until they were 2 miles off course and the sun was already high. Weapons qualification under time constraints that were only possible if you'd been practicing the specific drills for months. Solis had been practicing them for 2 years. She qualified first on day 3. Nobody said anything. That was also information. Drain ran the morning formations and seemed to take a particular interest in the details that would be hardest for her specifically. Extra weight added to her rucksack before a movement. Not documented, not official, just there when she put it on. A lane assignment during stress shooting that put her directly downwind of the range's exhaust system, diesel fumes thick enough to blur vision. Small things, deniable things, the kind of friction that doesn't show up in any report, because none of it, individually, crosses a line. Solis logged all of it in a small green notebook she kept in her left breast pocket, not to report it. She knew what reporting it would cost her. She logged it because tracking hostile patterns was a sniper's first discipline, and she had decided, somewhere around the 4th day, to treat this course the way she treated every other operational problem. As a target environment, not a personal one. That distinction mattered. It was the only thing that kept her from making it personal. Her rack was in the corner of the barracks building, a deliberate assignment she'd been given without explanation. The corner meant she could put her back to 2 walls. It also meant the walk to the bathroom in the middle of the night was the longest of anyone's. Small calculations, all of them. She noted them. She adapted. She slept in 4-hour cycles and woke before the alarm every time because her nervous system had learned, over years, that the quiet before a formation was the only quiet she was going to get. The other candidates in her cohort were 12 men and 1 other woman, a prior Marine named Cassell, who had been through Fallujah and didn't say much. Cassell had her own set of calculations to make. They didn't discuss it. They didn't need to. There is a kind of understanding between people who are surviving the same weather without ever talking about the weather, a sideways acknowledgement, a shared calibration of the air. Solis and Cassell had that. They ate near each other at chow without planning it. They ran in silence, side by side during PT when the formation allowed it. 3 candidates dropped in week 2. 2 from physical failures, 1 from a technical evaluation he'd failed twice. The cohort got quieter after that, quieter and more watchful. Solis's scores were not just passing, they were leading. On the wind reading practical, a skill that separated candidates more reliably than almost anything else, because it could not be faked or powered through on grit. She calculated corrections to within half a minute of angle in conditions that were shifting every few seconds. The evaluator, a master sergeant named Oben who had run the course for 9 years, marked her sheet without expression and moved on. She had learned to interpret that kind of neutrality. It meant she was performing at a level that made certain people uncomfortable, and they had not yet decided what to do about it. Drain had decided. He just hadn't done it yet. The ambush came in week 3, during a long-range stalking exercise that ran over 36 hours of continuous movement through dense woodland. The exercise required candidates to move from point A to a final firing position without being spotted by a team of trained observers, establish a hide, and engage a target set at 600 meters. It was the kind of task that was less about physical strength and more about patience, about becoming something the environment ignored, about existing in the same space as other living things without disturbing the texture of it. Solis was good at this, had been since she was young, since years of hunting season in central Montana with her father, who had taught her to sit so still that the birds came back after she'd startled them, who had told her once that patience was just attention made physical. She'd thought about that a lot over the years. Attention made physical. It was as good a description of the sniper's discipline as she'd ever heard. She was 6 hours into the stalking lane when she found the deviation. Someone had altered her designated route markers, small pieces of surveyor's tape tied to branches at eye level. It was done subtly enough that a candidate in a hurry or one who was already fatigued would have missed it. The altered markers would have taken her a kilometer off course into a section of the training area that wasn't part of the exercise, where she'd have burned time and distance recovering. By the time she corrected, she'd have been behind the time standard and flagged for failure. She stood for a moment at the first altered marker studying it. The knot was different from the standard course markers. A different technique, made quickly, functional but not trained. She photographed it with the small camera she carried for documentation purposes. Then she went around it, not back, around. She had already memorized the terrain from the map study she'd done the night before, and she navigated without the markers for the next 4 hours, moving on internal compass and ground feature identification alone. She reached the final firing position with 40 minutes to spare. Oben was in the observer position when she appeared, not from the direction he'd expected. She had approached from the dead ground to the northwest, the direction that required the most patience and the steepest angle of movement through the terrain. He looked at his watch, then at his grid map, then at her. She showed him the photograph on the camera. She didn't say anything else. He looked at it for a long time. He wrote something in his notebook. He marked her sheet and moved on, the same as always. That evening, Drain found reasons to keep her on additional duties until 20s and 300 hours. She cleaned weapons she hadn't fired. She inventoried equipment that had already been inventoried. She did it without comment and went to her rack at 11:15 and lay there staring at the ceiling. She was not angry. She noticed she was not angry, and that observation was itself a kind of information. What she felt was something closer to the condition her father had described once, after a long season when everything about the hunt had been harder than it should have been. Tired in the way that has a bottom to it, where you know the tiredness is finite because you can feel the floor under it. She was tired like that. Not the other kind. Not the kind that doesn't have a bottom. She thought about him, her father. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Solis, 75th Ranger Regiment, killed in action when Kira was 11 years old. She had a photograph of him she'd carried through 3 deployments, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and once through a 6-month advisory mission in a country whose name she still wasn't supposed to say. In the photograph, he was in his 20s, standing in front of a Humvee with the same expression she recognized in her own face in mirrors, not smiling, not serious, just present, just watching. She had not told anyone here about him. It didn't belong here. Some things you keep separate from the environment that's trying to grind you down, because if you let them in, the environment gets to touch them. She slept in 4-hour cycles. She woke before the alarm. Week 4 was the long week. The one the cadre designed to hit candidates at the point when the initial adrenaline had worn off and the body was beginning to calculate whether what it was being asked to do was sustainable. Solis had been through enough training to know what this week was for. It wasn't about the skills. It was about finding out who people were when there was nothing left propping them up, except the answer to one quiet question. Why are you still here? She knew her answer. She'd known it since she was 11 years old. 2 more candidates dropped in week 4. One of them, Maris, had been one of the better performers in the cohort. Not the top, but technically solid and consistent. He dropped on a Thursday morning quietly, turned in his gear, and was gone before lunch. Solis didn't know what happened. She didn't ask. That was another discipline. Not spending attention on what wasn't her lane. Cassell was still there, and they ran. In silence. The shift happened in week 5, and it happened the way shifts usually do in closed environments, not as a single event, but as a slow redistribution of weight. The cohort had seen her scores. They had watched her navigate the stalking lane deviation, without anyone telling them what happened, only that she had completed the exercise at the top of the time standard from a direction no one had expected. They had watched her clean weapons she hadn't fired without complaint, because in a cohort of exhausted candidates, The ability to absorb additional friction without losing form was the kind of thing people noticed even when they weren't trying to. A candidate named Polson, quiet from the 82nd Airborne, the kind of person who only spoke to say something that needed saying, asked her one morning at chow how she'd approached the wind call on the day 4 qualification. She explained it. He listened, he nodded once, and went back to eating. It was nothing. It was also everything. In an environment like that, one person asking a sincere question is the first stone out of the wall. Drain noticed. He moved her range position the following week, putting her further down the firing line, where the angle to the target was marginally worse. It was within regulation. It was not random. Solis set up her equipment, made the angular adjustment to her corrections, and fired. Her group was tighter than anyone else's on the line. She wrote the position adjustment in her green notebook. She added the new firing data. She adapted. There is a particular kind of resilience that doesn't look like resilience from the outside. It doesn't have the character of defiance or drama. It looks like someone doing the next thing, just the next thing, without reference to the last thing or the thing before that. The cadre could see it. Even the ones who were part of the machinery working against her. She did not perform endurance. She just endured. Oben said nothing to her directly for the first 5 weeks of the course. He communicated through the marking sheets and the performance evals and the occasional written comment in the margins. In week 6, he stopped next to her position during a field exercise and watched her work for 2 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "Your natural point of aim is slightly left. You're compensating. Adjust your body position before you acquire." She adjusted. Her next round was dead center. "Good," he said. That was all. It was enough. By week 7, the cohort had 8 candidates remaining. Solis was leading on aggregate score. It was not close. The gap between her and the second-place candidate, Polson, who had kept asking questions and had gotten better for it, was measurable but not dramatic. What was dramatic was the gap between her and the rest. She was not just passing this course. She was defining what passing it looked like. Drain made one more move in week 7. During a night qualification event, the live fire exercise that carried significant weight in the final scoring, her assigned firing position was changed at the last moment, officially due to a range safety reorientation, documented, defensible. The new position required her to engage the target set from an angle that reversed the wind compensation she'd calculated over the previous 2 hours of observation. She had 45 seconds to recalculate when she arrived at the new position. She lay down, she reset her data, she rebuilt her wind call from the vegetation movement in the immediate area. Grass stems at 3 meters, branches at 50, the behavior of smoke from a burn pile 200 meters to the northeast. She had done this before. Not in training. In a valley she was not supposed to have been in conditions considerably worse than these, with considerably higher stakes than a course evaluation. She engaged the target set, 5 rounds, 5 impacts. 2 of them were called center mass in the dark by the range safety officer without knowing who had fired them. Oben was at the scoring table when she came off the range. He looked at her sheet. He made a mark. He did not look up. She didn't need him to. The final week was administrative. Evaluations, after-action reviews, the formal processing that turned performance into record. There was no ceremony in it. The military is generally better at beginning things than ending them. And the conclusion of a course like this one tended to arrive less as a conclusion than as a sudden absence of the pressure that had defined everything for 8 weeks. Solis sat through the final formation and received her completion certificate from the course director, not Drain, who was pointedly absent that morning, but a colonel from the installation command who had been brought in for the formal closeout. He shook her hand and looked at her scores and said, with the particular economy of senior officers who had learned that most words were unnecessary, "Good work, Sergeant." She thanked him. She did not cry. She did not feel the urge to. What she felt was a kind of settled quality, like a level finding its rest. Not elation, not vindication, just the solid and quiet knowledge that she had done what she came to do. Castle was standing 3 positions down the formation line. They didn't look at each other. They didn't need to. There is a particular thing that happens when someone survives a process designed to remove them. Not the surviving itself. That's visible, it can be documented and scored and put on a record. It's the thing underneath the surviving, the person they become in the negative space of everything that was thrown at them. The competence they had to grow in places the training didn't intend to reach. Solis had come into this course as a skilled soldier. She left it as something more specific than that. A person who now knew, with the kind of clarity that only comes from having been tested at the level of the actual, exactly what she was made of and exactly how much of it there was. That knowledge doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look different on the outside. It sits very quietly in the center of a person and changes the way everything else moves around it. She packed her gear that afternoon. The green notebook went into her kit bag with everything else. 6 weeks of entries, adjusted positions, altered markers, extra duty assignments, small frictions, all of it logged with the same handwriting, the same format, the same compression of detail that she applied to any operational record. Evidence of a specific kind of weather, evidence that she had moved through it and come out the other side at the top of her class. She carried the bag to her vehicle and loaded it and sat for a moment in the driver's seat before starting the engine. The training area spread out through the windshield. The ranges, the woodline, the low buildings where the cadre worked. It was an ordinary piece of ground. It had been trying for 8 weeks to be more than that. She started the engine. There are people who need to be seen winning in order to understand that they've won. Solis wasn't one of those people. She had her notebook. She had her scores. She had the particular memory of 5 rounds in the dark. 2 of them called center mass, without anyone knowing her name. She pulled out of the lot and drove north, toward the gate, toward the highway, toward the next thing. The training area shrank in the rearview mirror, and then it was gone, the way all terrain eventually goes. Behind you, receding, already becoming the past. She drove with both hands on the wheel and the window cracked, cold air coming in off the tree line, and she felt for the first time in 8 weeks, something close to ordinary. Just a person on a road, just a soldier heading back to her unit with new qualifications and old discipline and a quiet interior life that no amount of small cruelties had managed to reach. The highway opened up ahead of her. She pressed the accelerator. She kept driving.